I was born Naomi Marie Blackwood, but after marrying Nicholas in 1981, my name changed to Naomi Canton. I kept that name until 3 weeks ago, the day after we laid him to rest. Even with my arthritic hands, I remember the sensation of braiding my daughter Melissa's hair in elementary school, as well as the sourdough bread that my son Brandon would beg for every Sunday morning. I am 68 years old. I tell you this so you understand that I was just a mother who thought she was raising decent children before everything fell apart. Nicholas died from cancer after 14 months. Pancreatic cancer is a silent killer that gives you a little time to get your life in order, but never allows you to fully appreciate the knowledge you gain. At first, we didn't tell anyone. While Brandon was preoccupied with his Boston financial consulting career, which seemed to force him to miss every major holiday, and Melissa with her Denver wellness businesses, which somehow required another investment from Dad, our children were preoccupied with their own lives. While looking at the ceiling in our bedroom, Nicholas mentioned that they aren't quite ready to deal with this burden yet. His speech was slightly slurred from the morphine. Give them some more time to live without this cloud hanging over them. Despite knowing better, I nodded out of affection for him. Our kids were familiar to me. They were devastated when they arrived at our humble farmhouse on the outskirts of Millfield, Pennsylvania, where they had spent their formative years, and where Nicholas and I had transformed Canton Family Orchards, which began as 20 acres of abandoned apple trees, into one of the state's most esteemed organic fruit orchards. Concerning the will, they arrived to inquire. Brandon explained, "Mother, I'm just trying to be pragmatic," his voice assuming the air of superiority he had mastered following his initial 6-figure bonus. He first mentioned it while we were sitting at the kitchen table, and Nicholas was sound asleep upstairs. "There must be a huge amount of medical debt. Are you two considering relocating? It cannot be easy to run the company on your own." Brandon left Millfield when he was 18 years old, claiming that life in small-town Pennsylvania was as oppressive as the dirt that had paid for his education. Because the country air irritates my sinuses, he usually stayed in a hotel rather than his childhood bedroom when he visited, and he only did so if absolutely necessary. However, in the final weeks of his father's life, he became obsessed with the family business, which had shamed him since he was a teenager. Melissa arrived 3 days later, lugging 6 bags and the stench of 5 failed wellness ventures that she had started with her father's money but had to abandon because they required actual labor. "This is why I still don't understand what happened next," she sobbed into Nicholas's embrace the night before he died and slept next to his bed. Nicholas requested a modest ceremony. His grave was located on a hilltop overlooking the orchards where the first signs of spring blossoms were just emerging. Melissa sobbed into a monogrammed handkerchief that I had never seen before, and Brandon's arms were tightly wrapped around my shoulders as they lowered him to the ground. The pastor says he is now at peace. I couldn't help but wonder if it was actually said when someone died after being in excruciating pain, or if it was just a common saying. While neither Nicholas nor I were particularly religious, we had followed the social norm of attending church on occasion, so Pastor Williams understood that Nicholas valued the land over any potential reward in heaven. The subsequent quiet is the part of that day that sticks with me the most. People were dropping off casseroles and whispering stories about Nicholas's honesty and generosity, such as how he saved Miss Peterson's dairy farm from the economic downturn or hired the Wilson boys for summer jobs. No one mentioned the fact that he started our company from scratch while caring for 2 children who did not appear to have absorbed any of his values. I informed Brandon and Melissa that I had prepared the guest rooms as the last guests left that evening. "I was hoping to spend some time tomorrow going through your father's belongings." Brandon spoke to his mother in a manner reminiscent of his father while delicately placing his whiskey glass on the table. Melissa and I discussed the situation, and we both believed that a quick resolution would be most beneficial, We should both return. Make peace, Melissa." Melissa discussed the estate while scrolling through her phone. The home and the company. We, Brandon and I, must decide what happens next. I assumed my children would be sad and miss their father. Instead, I was offered a meeting in a boardroom. Brandon opened his laptop at the dining table where we had celebrated their arrival, graduation, and birthdays. My father told me this without looking me in the eyes last year. He was concerned about how you would fare alone. The company must update its systems and invest money in them. The house is too big for someone your age. The repetition of the words "my age" made them taste bitter. "For 40 years, I worked alongside your father to manage this orchard." Melissa praised you in the same tone she used to pitch expensive vitamins to vulnerable women. "But now is the time to plan for the future, Mother. A retirement community offers companionship and meaningful pursuits." "Well, I'm fortunate to have friends. I'm going to be busy." Even I could tell that my voice sounded far away. "This is what I call home." Brandon correctly pointed out that this is our home. Dad also bequeathed the business to Melissa and me through his will. Even though he wanted us to look after you, he recognized that the company needed new leadership. I saw my son, this unidentified man, dressed in flashy clothes, claiming to be an expert on the land that had provided for his family and the trees that his father had protected from pests and diseases. "Please prove it to me." He passed a document across the table that was printed on Brandon's business stationery, not our family lawyer's letterhead. Nicholas's signature appeared strange to a man whose hands had been quivering in agony for months. It was too steady, too flawless. "Did you ask him to sign this while under the influence of morphine?" A primal rage welled up within me at that moment, unlike anything I'd felt since the day a fox attempted to break into our chicken coop when the kids were young. With a broom and the zeal that comes with defending one's possessions, I drove it away. Brandon believed he was fully conscious. He insisted on starting over with the company. The property is appealing to a developer. Developer Melissa described the opportunity to work for a high-end housing community with a smile on her face. "Mom, it's $7 million. We can all start over, as if the life Nicholas and I had built was old and useless, as if the sustainable farming methods, the legacy of the Canton family orchards, the refusal to sell to large grocery chains that would exploit our workers, and the annual donation of 10% of our harvest to local food banks were insignificant in comparison to the idea of cookie-cutter houses for affluent Philadelphia weekenders. I refused to sign anything and stated more calmly than I felt that your father would never sell this land for development. Brandon patiently explained how it was unnecessary. Both the home and the business were registered in Dad's name. Community property does not apply in Pennsylvania. At that point, I realized they had planned this well before Nicholas became ill, if not before. How long had my son been anticipating his father's death in order to sell off our family business? How many times had Melissa called to confirm their plan rather than to inquire about Nicholas's health? "I need time," I said, rising to my feet. "I'm going to take a nap now. We'll talk about this tomorrow, but that's all." My children were finishing up their final preparations as I lay awake in the bed Nicholas and I shared, staring at the ceiling and hearing the creaks and groans of our old farmhouse. The aroma of the expensive coffee Brandon had brought from Boston in the morning wafted through the air, a welcome change from the unpalatable local store brand. I moved slowly as I dressed my body, stiff from years of age loss and the cold realization of my children's maturation. They were waiting for me downstairs with a small suitcase that I couldn't recognize. Melissa cheerfully informed him that they had brought some necessities. I was thinking Brandon and I would drive you to Sunny Pines today so you could see it. An idyllic retirement community is only 2 hours away. While making coffee for myself, I reminded myself that I had no plans to relocate to a retirement community. This is what I call home. Mom, do the right thing. Brandon let out a heavy sigh. Every piece of documentation was addressed. Next week, we will finalize the developer agreement. Being here is not an option. At the time, I was completely focused on my son and couldn't see Nicholas's face. There is no trace of the child who, at dawn, would accompany his father to the orchard, inquiring endlessly about pollination and pruning techniques. A complete stranger who treated me as a burden to be controlled. With a whisper, I mentioned that I needed to get my medication from the bathroom and that I'd like to take some photos. "Excuse me, Mom?" Melissa agreed, her voice filled with relief. "Feel free to bring any belongings you want. The remaining documents may be sent at a later time." On my final tour of my childhood home, I touched the weathered banister that Nicholas had sanded and revarnished every 5 years, the quilt that my grandmother had sewn and hung over our bed, and the window seat where I had read aloud to my children on rainy days. In the restroom, I not only got my prescriptions, but I also slipped my birth certificate and passport into the secret compartment of the medicine cabinet Nicholas had built back in the late 1980s when we were first concerned about burglaries. The small fireproof box was hidden behind Nicholas's collection of slightly musty flannel shirts in our bedroom closet. It contained the only secret my children were unaware of. Brandon was looking at his watch as I walked downstairs, my purse heaving, but my heart a little lighter from determination. "Are we all set?" he inquired. Not really an inquiry. I allowed Melissa to take my arm, as if I were the frail old lady they had always imagined me to be, and I nodded in agreement. Brandon had arranged for us to rent a stylish black SUV with leather seats that were so tight that they pressed against my legs. Looking out the back window, I treasured the memories of my childhood home as they faded away. I could still see the apple tree's early spring blossoms, the barn's weathered red paint, and the stone chimney Nicholas had rebuilt the summer before Brandon was born. I still taught quilting on Wednesday evenings at the community center, and we drove past the elementary school where I had volunteered, as well as Millfield's small downtown. Brandon chose County Road 27, a rural route that cut through farmland before connecting to the interstate over continuing on the highway toward larger towns with retirement communities. He hopped onto the shoulder next to a vacant field 20 minutes later. He whirled around to face me as the engine remained idle. "Dad, this is where you will disembark," he announced in an unsettlingly calm voice. "I fully own both the house and the business. Excuse me." Melissa demonstrated some manners by pretending to be perplexed. "Hello, Brandon, what's happening?" He became angry in response to our conversation. "Nothing Mom does will make things easier. She'll cause a scene, challenge the will, and make us look foolish in front of the developer. This is more sanitary. Her medication and a few items of clothing are with her, however. A gas station will be visible about 5 miles ahead of you. She has a quilting friend she can contact." He leaned over me to unlock the door. "Mom, go outside." I examined my son for any signs of the innocent soul I had cherished but came up empty-handed. Following that, I focused on my daughter, whose wide eyes darted from one of us to the other as her jaw moved like a fish's. I inquired about Melissa. However, I was already aware that she would be with him. Naturally, she did. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "We desperately need this money. I am indebted." Stepping out onto the gravel shoulder, I nodded once before retrieving my purse and the small suitcase they had packed. There was a hint of cool spring air, earthy smells, and impending rain in the air. Brandon drove away without looking back while I stood there clutching my bag. Melissa's pale face could be seen through the rear window until they reached the top of a hill and disappeared. They believed that without a phone, there would be no way of communicating. All they knew was my name and the things they didn't realize I still had. I realized then that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I was completely free. Free of the pretense that these people deserved my love solely because I brought them into the world. Let go of the burden of being a mother to children who saw me as a hindrance rather than a support system. I turned away from the gas station Brandon had mentioned and started walking towards an unimaginable future for them. I had my passport, medicine, and a deed in my purse. It was the original deed for 20 acres of land in my maiden name, which I had purchased before marrying Nicholas. It was the most profitable 20 acres at the time, with the water rights that any developer would require. It appeared that my children had abandoned me with nothing. They were on the verge of realizing their mistake. We spent nearly 2 hours walking to town. Country roads were not designed to accommodate the practical flats I wore to my husband's funeral. By the time I arrived at Miller's Gas and Grocery located on the outskirts of Millfield, I had blisters on my feet and a sunburned neck. Forget about it. With each step, my purpose became clearer, and pain has a way of doing that. I didn't immediately step inside. Rather, I sat on the bench outside watching the cars and trucks pass by. Everyone went about their daily lives as usual, unaware that Naomi Canton, whose children had just abandoned her like roadkill, had been judging their apple pies at the county fair for the past 2 decades. Madam Canton. As I raised my eyes, I noticed Ray Miller, the store's 3rd-generation owner, dabbing at his apron. "Do you feel fine? You appear to be quite agitated." "Ray, I am just relaxing. Day 1 is over." Looking down at my travel bag, he gave me his silent approval. "I'm very sorry for Nicholas's loss. The man was respectable." "Yes, he was." My back straightened. "Ray, do you mind if I borrow your phone? It appears that I misplaced mine." In one word, yes. He escorted me inside, past the snack aisles and beer coolers, to the cramped office behind the counter. "Go at your own pace." Despite Brandon's advice, I avoided contacting any of my quilting acquaintances. I contacted our family lawyer of 30 years, Vincent Hargrove. "Hello, Naomi. I tried to contact you yesterday. It caught me off guard that you were not present at the reading." My grip on the phone became more firm. "What text is it?" Vincent maintained silence for a brief moment. "A reading from the will. I had, when your son brought in the document. Concerns. I wish I could reach out to you sooner." Despite my growing anger, I kept my voice steady. I'd been sick. "Help me out, Vincent. I need to keep this secret. 2 of them are yours." Where is my workplace? What a half hour! It'll be me. I slipped some cash into a hidden compartment of my purse and used it to buy a cheap prepaid phone. Years ago, after we became stuck due to a flat tire, Nicholas insisted that we both have emergency funds. I purchased a bottle of water in addition to the sandwich and water, despite the fact that I was not hungry. No, Ray would not take my money. "Naomi, talk about your home. Is anything else expected of you? Everyone is welcome to ask." He was so kind that I nearly broke. It was nearly there. But I would not cry now, as I had not done when Nicholas was laid to rest. Vincent's law office was located on Main Street on the 2nd floor of a Victorian building. My secretary's eyes widened as soon as she saw me. "Miss Canton, Mr. Hargrove expects you." She ran out from behind her desk. "Do you need anything? Do you mean water? Coffee?" "Absolutely. Don't worry, Helen. I appreciate it." I was met at the door of Vincent's office. Age had reduced his once proud stature, but his keen eyes remained unwavering. He had handled our company's incorporation, wills, and all legal matters since he was a year behind Nicholas in school. "Naomi, please." Instead of sitting behind his desk, he guided me to a leather chair and sat next to me. "Please explain what's going on." After that, I did. The motivation, the suspicions, the conversation after the funeral, and the abandonment. His expression became more glum as he recounted each detail. As I finished, he informed me that the will they presented to you was not the one Nicholas and I drafted last year. They have created a forged document. I had the same impression. I went ahead and took the fireproof box out of my purse. I removed the title to the first 20 acres. This is unknown to them. Vincent slowly nodded as he examined the act. Smart, impressively astute. You two had an uncanny ability to plan ahead. During our initial insurance expansion, Nicholas suggested I keep this portion in my maiden name. In the event that the company failed, he dialed it. It's evolved into a new type of insurance. Vincent carefully arranged the deed on his desk. Hello, Naomi. What is on your mind? Our gaze is locked. Please return to my home. I hope my children realize how much of an impact they've had by continuing the company my husband founded. Vincent didn't bat an eyelid despite my icy tone of voice. He simply nodded instead. Finding a place to stay for the night should be our top priority. An opening has arisen at my sister's bed and breakfast. The legal work will begin tomorrow. No, that's my protest. That's not fast enough for me. Next week, the developer will close. It finally clicked for Vincent. You have other plans than going to court. Vincent, the courts are reserved for the wealthy. Better ideas are on my mind. I took my first call that night while sitting in the Rose Hill bed and breakfast surrounded by floral wallpaper. Not in front of my children. They might be concerned about my whereabouts, wondering if I made it to town or if I passed out along the way. My intended recipient was Harold Winters. Canton Family Orchards had been a long-term client of Pennsylvania Trust Bank. Mrs. Canton, I apologize for your husband's death. Hello, Harold. I am grateful. I'm calling to request your assistance in protecting our remaining business interests after uncovering some questionable transactions. Second on my list was agricultural extension agent Martin Adams, with whom I had worked for 15 years. Naomi, I apologize for missing our chance to talk during the funeral. Martin, I'm aware. All over the place. Please provide some information about a possible development on county farmland. My third stop was at the home of Sophia Delaney Nicholas, second cousin and editor of the Millfield Gazette. Hey, Ellie, how are things going? Concerned, yes. Sophia, I have a story about developers, protected agricultural land, and inheritance fraud that you might be interested in. I'm handling it. By midnight, I had 7 calls under my belt, each adding thread to the web I was building. Naomi Canton, who was always trying to bring people together and make them feel safe, was secretly planning a war as I looked out my window at Millfield's peaceful streets. Early that day, I discovered Vincent waiting for me in his office, clutching a legal pad brimming with notes. I informed him that immediate action was required, including the freezing of company accounts and the filing of an injunction to prevent the sale of the property subject to the fraudulent will. Vincent raised an eyebrow as he reviewed my notes. Here we have, comprehensive. Nicholas was my partner for 40 years. Every client contract and detail of that business is familiar to me. The more I lean forward, the more of it I plan to use. Your offspring will not remain silent on this. This is my expectation. By midday, the pieces began to move. Vincent filed the urgent injunction. Harold had placed a hold on the company funds until the investigation into questionable behavior was completed. Martin contacted the Environmental Board because of the protected wetlands on the site of the proposed development, which also happened to be on my 20 acres. It was getting close to 1 p.m., and I was sitting in Vincent's office, waiting for my kids to discover that their well-laid plans had hit their first snag. My new prepaid phone rang, and they had no business knowing the number. However, Vincent had made certain that they had received it. My voice remained composed as I waited for it to ring 4 times before responding. Naomi is here. Dear Mom, Brandon's voice was brimming with rage. So what is your next move? I grinned, even though he couldn't see it. This is only the beginning. Mom, do the right thing. Brandon's voice became more rigid while on the phone. Frozen accounts and injunctions are ineffective. What the hey? You're messing up our deal. I violated your agreement. This isn't my work. This is not your father's. So where did you go? Melissa interrupted with an angry tone. It was clear that Brandon had recorded me. We are absolutely terrified. The lie hung over us like a poisonous cloud. They hadn't contacted friends or the police. They had been preoccupied with carrying out their treachery. Concerned about my fate, my voice was completely flat when I inquired. Are you concerned that I did not simply vanish? Melissa argued that it was unfair. I was wrong, Brandon. Stop talking, Brandon told Melissa. Already shattered, I smiled into the phone. Take note of what's said. I'm giving you one chance to make a good impression. Set your deceitful will aside. Please return the house and business to my name. You will each receive $50,000 from me as compensation. We'll wrap up after that. Brandon gave a hideous laugh. What a load of nonsense. There is nothing in your possession. Legally, the will stands. Vincent, leaning toward the speakerphone on his desk, interjected, claiming that the will was forged. I can attest to this because I was the attorney who drafted Nicholas Canton's will. There was complete silence all along the line. I told you you had 24 hours. The offer will be null and void, and I will proceed with fraud charges. I ended the call before they could respond. Vincent relaxed in his chair, letting himself go. You are aware that they will probably decline. This is my expectation. I stood up and got my wallet. I must now physically visit the bank. The next 24 hours were spent on paperwork, phone calls, and secret meetings in back offices throughout Millfield. Supporters, witnesses, and informants who had known Nicholas and me for decades provided details, signatures, and endorsements. It is courteous, not sympathy-driven, and perhaps a little joy in seeing the Canton children who had fled their hometown in search of greener pastures meet their maker. By nightfall, I was in a small apartment above Lucille's bakery. Lucy Brennan, the proprietor, and I had been friends since our children were in kindergarten together. As she pressed the key into my palm, she instructed me to stay as long as I needed. This town will never forgive your boy. Alternatively, goodbye to both of you, Nicholas. As the aromas of freshly baked bread and pastries wafted up from the kitchen, I slept surprisingly well that night. First thing in the morning, I prepared for battle by putting on the clothes. Lucille had lent me a sweater that fit well and jeans that fit perfectly. I proved my ownership of the original 20 acres, which included the main house, the barn, and most importantly, the water access that any developer would require by filing paperwork at 9 a.m. when the deed office opened. Despite Brandon's best efforts, development would be extremely difficult due to conservation easements that Nicholas and I had covertly established years before. My meeting with the Agricultural Board began at 10 a.m. The Millfield Gazette headline read, "Local Orchard at Center of Inheritance," and Sophia and I met in their office at noon to provide the necessary documentation for the coverage. Is this a contentious discussion? The proposed development endangers conserved farmland. After lunch, my phone started ringing again. As a greeting, I stated that the offer was no longer being considered. Listen, Mom, this is a major mistake on your part. Brandon's voice had initially appeared arrogant, but it now sounded panicked. If we fail to meet the promised deadline, the developer's legal team has threatened legal action. It appears that is the problem you are experiencing. Melissa broke in. And that is our problem. Mother, I beg you. Some of my debts were paid off with the advance. I'll be devastated if this does not work out. You should have thought about this before abandoning me on the side of the road. Brandon had the idea, and she sobbed. I only found out while we were on the road. Their mutual betrayal left me feeling empty-handed. I had a chilly but necessary sense of justice being served, but nothing else made me happy. Melissa, your bank records show that you withdrew $50,000 3 days before your father's funeral. My tone was objective and dispassionate. Are you already planning for your new beginning? Her sobbing began. When she was upset, I'd heard her let out dramatic heaving cries. Tears are futile at this point, I said. Vince will send the necessary documents. By signing, you waive any claim to the house and Canton Family Orchards. In exchange, I agree not to file charges for theft, attempted elder abuse, or fraud. The amount of $50,000, Brandon inquired, his business mind still preoccupied with calculations. I explained that the offer had already passed. You only get to avoid jail time. As soon as I hung up, I set the phone down and looked out the window of Vincent's office at the town where I had lived my entire adult life. As it did every Thursday, the farmer's market across the street was getting ready to open. People went about their daily lives as usual, greeting neighbors, checking out the produce, and avoiding situations in which children abandoned their mothers on the side of the road. They're going to fight, Vincent warned as he placed a teacup beside me. Permit them. I had not touched any of the tea. Another call is still pending from my end. I dialed a number that I had memorized many years before but rarely used. Hello? Robert, Naomi Canton is here. I believe it's about time I asked for that favor. Prior to meeting Nicholas and Robert shared a room at Penn State. They remained friends after Robert relocated to Philadelphia to start what would eventually become the state's most prominent real estate law firm. Nicholas had given Robert money after his first business failed 30 years ago. Expenditure funds were instrumental in reviving a practice that is now notorious for bringing down exploitative developers. Naomi, please. The warmth of his voice belied his recognition. As soon as I heard about Nicholas, I knew I had to call you. God, I apologize. Robert, I am grateful. Someone needs your help with something. I clarified everything. A developer, some forgeries, and some abandoned structures. Robert listened intently. After I finished speaking, there was such a long pause that I feared we had lost contact. Finally, his voice clenched with subdued rage. I'll be in Millfield tomorrow morning. Platinum Acres. The developers in question have piqued our interest. What they intend to do violates at least 6 environmental regulations, Naomi. You finally found the solution we were looking for. Yes. His paper shuffling was audible to me. Please do not sign anything before I arrive. It breaks my heart to hear about your children, Naomi. I responded by stating that I had decided to stop having children 3 days ago. I only have enemies now. As Lucille closed the bakery that night, I sat with a cup of tea and watched her prepare the dough for the following morning. As she pointed to the sandwich she had prepared for me, she suggested that I try to eat some food. You must use all of your power. This isn't hunger. After Nicholas died, I went without food. Food was no longer considered anything more than fuel. Lucille, who was kneading with deliberate motions, said she'd heard Melissa was staying at the Millfield Inn. Brandon is still in the house. Rumors are circulating. Simply listen to them. My kids despise the small-town gossip, but it now works for me. Every move they made was communicated to me within hours. Sophie's piece will be published the following day, Lucille explained. Page 1. Furthermore, the Philadelphia Inquirer contacted me. Their interest in the story has piqued. Apparently, the developer has had some issues with previous projects. Unsurprised, I nodded. I was right, and Robert's call proved it. Platinum Acres routinely exploited the elderly and other vulnerable landowners by making empty promises. Was the way we raised them the right choice? Before I could control myself, the question slipped out. I wanted to know where I had fallen short, not out of sentimentality, but out of genuine curiosity. Lucille's hands remained motionless within the dough. Ellie, you were a wonderful parent, and so was Nicholas. No matter how fertile the soil, some people simply rot. By nodding in agreement, I dismissed the pointless question and accepted her response. At this point, it was irrelevant. Nicholas's past was buried. Nothing remained but my vengeance and the future. 2 associates trailed behind Robert Wilson as he walked into Vincent's office in the morning, his immaculately dressed suit likely costing more than 3 months' Canton Orchard profits. "Naomi, please." He briefly embraced me.